Chapter 16 The Pirate Smokes the Peace Pipe. After dinner, all the crew turned out to hunt for turtle eggs on the sandbar. They poked sticks into the sand and found a soft place, then dug with their hands. Sometimes they found 50 or 60 eggs in one hole, and they had a famous fried egg feast that night and another the next morning. After breakfast, they went swimming again and over the bar. They stood in a swift current which tripped their legs from under them, from time to add to the fun. Now and then they splashed at each other's faces or ducked each other under. When they were tired, they would run out on the dry, hot sand and lie there and cover themselves up with it, and by get into the water again. Finally, they played circus. Next, they got their marbles and played every game they knew. Then Joe and Huck had another swim, but Tom didn't go because he had lost his good luck charm that made of rattlesnakes rattles, and he wanted to look for it. And when he did find it, the other boys were tired of swimming and ready to rest. They gradually wandered apart, dropped into the dumps, and fell to looking up the river to where the village lay in the sun. Tom found himself writing Becky in the sand with his big toe. He scratched it out, and then, angry with himself for his weakness, but he wrote it again, and he couldn't help it. Joe's spirits were very low. He was so homesick that he could hardly stand it, and he was ready to cry. Huck, who was sad too, even Tom. Tom tried hard not to show it, and said with a great show of cheerfulness, "I bet there's been pirates on this island before, boys, and there's hidden treasure here somewhere. We'll explore it again. How'd you like to light on a chest full of gold and silver, eh?" But there was no answer. No one was interested anymore, and Tom tried 2 or 3 other tricks, but they failed too. Joe sat poking up the sand with a stick and looking very gloomy. Finally he said, "Oh, boys, let's give it up. I don't want to. I want to go home. It's so lonesome." "Oh, no, Joe. You'll feel better by and by," said Tom. "Just think of all the fishing that we can do here." "I don't care for fishing. I want to go home," said Joe. "But, Joe, there isn't much another swimming place anywhere." "Swimming's no good. I meant to go home." "Oh, shucks, you baby," said Tom. "You want to see your mother, I guess?" "Yes, I do want to see my mother, and you would too if you had one." "Oh, I'm no more baby than you are." Joe sniffed a little. Well, let that crybaby go home to his mother, won't we, Huck? Poor thing doesn't want to see its mother, and so it shall. You like it here, don't you, Huck? Well, stay here, we will." Huck said yes, but he didn't mean it. "I'll never speak to you again as long as I live," said Joe, rising. "There now." He moved away and began to get ready. "Who cares?" declared Tom. "Nobody wants you. Go home along and get laughed at. Oh, you're a real nice pirate. Huck and I aren't crybabies. We'll stay, won't we, Huck? And let them go if they want, so I guess we can get along without him, perhaps." But Tom was uneasy, nevertheless, to see Joe getting ready to leave. Besides, Huck was watching Joe as if Huck wanted to go. Presently, without a good-bye, Joe began to wade off towards the shore. Tom's heart began to sink. He glanced at Huck, and Huck could not bear the look and dropped his eyes, then said, "I want to go too, Tom. It's getting so lonesome. Anyway, now I'll be worse. Let's go too, Tom." "I won't. I won't go." "You can go if you want to." "I mean to stay." "Tom, I better go." "Well, go. Who's stopping you?" Huck began to pick up his things. He said, "Tom, I wish you'd come. Now you think it over. We'll wait here when you get to shore." "Well, wait blamed as long as you want. That's all. I'm not coming," said Tom. Huck started off. Tom stood looking after him with a strong desire to forget his pride and to go too, and he hoped the boys would stop and come back, but they waded slowly on. He knew nothing would stop them but the secret he had been holding back. He ran after them and yelled, Wait, I want to tell you something." They stopped and turned around, and when Tom got to where they were, he told them the secret. At last, when he saw the point Tom was driving home, they set up a war whoop and said it was a good idea, and if he hadn't told them at first, they would never have started away. The lads came happily back, talking all the time about Tom's big plan. They went back on to their playing. And after a dainty egg and fish dinner, Tom said he wanted to learn to smoke, and Joe said he'd like to try too, so Huck made pipes and filled them. The boys stretched themselves out on their elbows and began to smoke. The smoke had an unpleasant taste, and they gagged a little, but Tom said, "Why, it is easy. If I had known this was all, I'd have learned long ago." "So would I," said Joe. "It's just nothing." "Why, many a times I've looked at people smoking and wished I could do that," said Tom, "but I never thought I could." "I believe I could smoke this pipe all day," said Joe. "I don't feel sick." "Neither do I," said Tom. "I could smoke all day. Bet I could. Do you think Jeff Thatcher's couldn't?" Top of page 90. Jeff Thatcher, why, he'd kneel over just with 2 draws, and just let him try it once. He'd see. "I bet he would," said John. "And Johnny Miller? I wish he could tackle this once." "Oh, don't I," said Joe. "Why, I bet you couldn't do any more of this than nothing. Just one little snifter would get 'em." "'Deed it would, Joe. Say, I wish the boys could see us now." "So do I." So the talk ran on, but soon it began to slow a bit. But the spitting increased. Their tongues burned, their mouths with water, so much that they couldn't help swallowing some of the tobacco juice. Oh, that's not good. They began to feel like throwing up. Both boys looked very pale and miserable now. Joe's pipe dropped from his fingers and Tom followed. Both were spitting wildly. Joe was feebly said, "I lost my knife. I guess I better go find it." "I'll help you," Tom said, trembling. "You go that way, and I'll hunt around here, the spring. You needn't come, Huck. We can find it." Huck sat down again, and he waited an hour, and then he found it lonesome, and went to find his comrades. They were wide apart in the woods, both very pale, both fast asleep. But something told him that if they had had any trouble with their smoking, they had gotten rid of it. Oof, they both got really sick from smoking. Don't smoke. They didn't talk much about supper that night. After the meal, Huck filled his pipe and was going to prepare theirs too, but they said no, they weren't feeling well. Something they ate had disagreed with them. Sure, that's what it was. About midnight, Joe awoke and called the boys. There was something in the air, something that seemed was coming. The boys grouped themselves together around the fire, and the air was hot and sticky. They sat still, watchful and waiting. Beyond the light of the fire, everything was darkness. A flash of lightning suddenly lit up the leaves, then vanished. By and by another came, a little stronger, then another. Next a faint moan came, sighing through the branches of the trees. The boys felt a breeze on their cheeks. Now a flash turned night into day, and thunder went rolling and tumbling down the heavens. A sweep of chilly air passed by, and another fierce flash lit the sky, and a crash came down that seemed to split the treetops right over the boys' heads. They clung together in terror. A few big raindrops fell patting upon the leaves. "Quick, boys, go for the tent!" exclaimed Tom. They sprang away, but not before another massive roared through the trees, and one blinding flash after another came along with some sounds of thunder. And now the rain was pouring down. However, one by one, the boys at last got under the tent, cold, scared, and streaming with water. The storm rose higher and higher, and presently the sail that made their tent went winging away on the wind. And the boys seized each other's hands and fled to the shelter of the great oak tree that stood upon the river bank. Now the storm was at its highest, and the lightning flashed everywhere, and the wind drove the river into white foam. And every now and then a great tree fell crashing to the ground on the island. Thunder exploded everywhere until it seemed the storm would tear the island to pieces. But at last the storm was done, and the boys went back to their camp to find that the great tree that had secured their shelter was ruined now, blasted by the lightning. They were thankful that they had not been under it when it had happened. Everything in camp was soaked, but the boys found a dry spot in a great log, and at last had a fire burning again. They piled great dead boughs until they saw a roaring furnace, and were glad-hearted once more. They had a boiled ham feast, and after that they sat by the fire until morning, for there was not a dry spot to sleep on anywhere. Their talk about midnight adventures until the sun came up. Then they went on to the sandbar and they lay down to sleep. After breakfast, they felt rusty and stiff jointed and a little homesickness once more. Tom saw the signs and tried to cheer them up as well as he could, but they didn't care for the old games anymore. Tom reminded them of the great secret that cheered them up for a while, and while it lasted, Tom said that they ought to play Indians for a change, and it wasn't long that they were war whooping with paint on their face, and they were attacking an English settlement, and were killing, then scalping each other by the thousands. They assembled into camp toward supper time, hungry and happy, and now a difficulty arose. Indians smoked a pipe of peace. Two of the Indians almost wished they had remained pirates. However, their wish was granted. I'm sorry. However, there was no way they were getting out of this. So, with as much cheerfulness as they could show, they called for the pipe and took a puff and passed it in due form. And behold, they found that if they took little whiffs, they didn't get sick enough to be uncomfortable. They were happy and proud to be Indians.